Marvel Snap is finally not pay to win. Let's take a look at Marvel Snap's newest season pass card, Captain Carter. Captain Carter is a 4/3 with an ongoing ability that adds her power to your cards in the back row. The back row at her location is defined as spots 3 and 4 in that location. This means she has a couple of inbuilt synergies. The first is that she has synergy with things that raise her power, which increases the amount of buffs that she can give to the things behind her. The second is she has synergy with things that lower her cost, like Zabu, so that she is able to be deployed earlier, thereby leaving more space for the things behind her. While she does work if she is in the 3rd position, she will only be giving the buff to the card in the 4th position, meaning that her impact is cut in half or in thirds, depending on how you want to think about it. Either way, the point that Carter is trying to make is that she is a genuinely okay card on her own that can become a real powerhouse when invested in. That is unfortunately also her drawback, as 4-cost cards in Marvel Snap tend to be much more standalone than she is. When you think of elite 4-cost cards, cards like Doom 2099, cards like Galacta, cards like Gwenpool, these are very often game plan in a can cards that are able to apply pressure and power to multiple locations in the game. Captain Carter is definitely not that. Her limitations are that she only goes on one location, she does not provide power to other locations, and you need to continue investing in that location if you want to be able to capitalize on her buffs. So at baseline, what she's saying is, if you fill the location, I am a 4/9. That's not actually terrible. It's really not bad on a rate. With one buff, and her sensitivity to buffs is her strength, she can become a very powerful card just on the numbers. She's almost like, if you'll pardon the sort of analogy here, a bit like an ongoing Brood, in the sense that she is a force multiplier for cards like Galacta and Gwenpool, and can see play in the context of future hand buff cards, where it would actually be a relevant thing to get her to, say, 5. Right now, though, the situation she finds herself in is that she ends up being not necessarily an underwhelming card, but underwhelming for a season pass. And that's part of the context that I wanted to talk about. So what we're going to do here is talk about the decks that play Captain Carter and what it means to be a season pass card in Marvel Snap, because I think a lot of people have sort of dialed in a certain idea of what a season pass card is and the standards a season pass card needs to get to that make Captain Carter look like a huge disappointment, when in fact, she's like a pretty interesting and reasonable card, although she does not in any way approach something like Sam Wilson, who is probably the best card in the game. Other downside to Captain Carter is that she is sort of tied to cards like that. Sam Wilson being as good as he is and being so important to ongoing decks, most decks that you see playing Captain Carter will have Sam Wilson, which definitely makes her less of a standalone. And that dynamic is also worth talking about in the context of what a season pass is and should be. So let's talk about the decks, and then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty. We're going to start with Doom 2099 Captain Carter. I was informed that this version of the deck was put together by Pulse Glazer from Snap Judgment, so shout out to him. But this is just sort of like, it's the Doom 2099 deck. You remember it. It's doing that same sort of thing. I am struck by Captain Carter in here because it is such a valuable card when you have a Zabu buff or when you are able to ramp out a Doom 2099, but it is such a not valuable card otherwise, in part because a lot of the ability of this deck to go wide is predicated on Doom 2099. Captain Carter might as well be a card that says you have to play this in the 2nd spot on a location, which means it's much easier to get value out of Captain Carter if you are turn 3ing a Doom 2099 into turn 4 Captain Carter. She's also far from the star here. You'll notice we're talking about Doom 2099 a lot more than we're talking about her. That's real. There's this mid-range game plan that the deck has where you're able to curve the Captain Americas into each other and then play a Doom 2099. And in that world, you're almost never going to want to play a Captain Carter as your one card, once you get to 5, you would almost always rather play Blue Marvel, then you would almost always rather play Spectrum or Doom. What that means is that Captain Carter sort of ends up a tertiary option in this deck. It's not a deck that is built around Captain Carter, it's a deck that's taking Captain Carter and applying her to a spot where she probably fits, but isn't really applying it to her in that way. You are not going to win a ton of games going Sam Wilson into Captain America into Captain Carter, especially in the world where we live in, where Enchantress and Rogue and, of course, Super Skrull are as popular as they are. What you are going to win games doing is going the Captain Americas into Doom 2099, into Blue Marvel, into Doctor Doom. That you can actually win games doing, but you end up playing almost more like a deck that's just trying to point check people, and you're a lot worse at stat checking people than you used to be. You end up in a weird spot when you play a deck like this, because I think on the whole, it ends up being a little bit worse than the other shells for Goliath, for example, but you also end up being a lot less vulnerable to Enchantress. The major upside of a deck like this right now is that because so many of your ongoings are like Doom related, and because you can be a Doom deck, that Enchantress doesn't just solo you. It doesn't get completely obliterating you. And I think that also applies to Super Skrull. Again, because your ongoings a lot of the time aren't going to be as useful for your opponent as they are for you, you're not going to be giving your opponent, 2 Iron Men on a Super Skrull. You're going to be giving them some Doom 2099 procs, and that's not something you have to worry about giving them. So the upside of this deck is not so much that it's like objectively powerful, but it's metagame contextual. This is a deck that seems sort of like a better fit for the current metagame, which is heavily anti-ongoing. The other direction you can go with Captain Carter is saying, I'm not going to bother with the ongoing stuff. What I'm going to do is try to give her power the old-fashioned way, or I guess you'd call it the new-fashioned way. While cards like Nakia have been in the game forever, cards like Galacta and Gwenpool are much more recent additions. Another thing that Captain Carter really likes is cost reduction. Being able to pick and choose where to play her as a big, beefy card is genuinely good. This is a deck that builds towards her being a high impact card, something like a 418 effectively off of a Galacta proc and then filling up a lane. That's the kind of thing that this deck is trying to do. Win a game with Captain Carter, Zabu discount, Sarah discount, get like a final turn giant Captain Carter with some support alongside maybe some Shang-Chi action. That's your goal. It's a reasonable goal to have, although in practice I think it ends up coming a bit... it takes a little bit of work, and you're probably winning games more off of your Sarah Tech game plan than you are off of Captain Carter's inclusion in your Sarah Tech game plan. I think she's a fine place to try to get points in a deck like this, but I don't think this is a deck that necessarily was in the business of I need points at this rate. And you might get something better out of just like playing a Gladiator or something where it's like, this is something I can count on more. It'll be cheaper. And although there is massive upside in Zabu, it's going to be a lot better to have a Gladiator when you're not Zabuing your Captain Carter, because being able to go Shang-Chi for 3, Gladiator for 2, 2 drop for 1 is usually going to be better. You can also try Captain Carter in the small ongoing package. I do think it's very nice that we've gotten a couple of Season Pass cards that have done a lot to revitalize actual Captain America. I think that is really, really good long term, where both Sam Wilson and Captain America are, like, these are iconic characters, and the fact that Captain America is coming back into the meta because of Sam Wilson, because of Captain Carter, I think that's very good. This is a deck that keys off of Captain America a pretty shocking amount. Your mid-range game plans typically revolve around having a Sam and a Cap. That's when this deck is able to curve out the best. Having a Cap is excellent in the context of having a Cap to buff Captain Carter, but here we get to kind of an awkward thing about Captain Carter, is that, like, a lot of the time, your Captain America is gonna be enough to not necessarily win a lane on its own, but allow you to invest less in a lane because he's giving you more out of the cards that you get in that lane. When you are devoting both a Captain America and a Captain Carter to a lane in order to get more value out of the Captain Carter, you end up sort of looking at it like, did I overcommit to that lane? And I think this deck, and Captain Carter generally, kind of lends itself to overcommits. You end up winning one lane by like 1 billion, or you get Enchantress and lose it, and then your other lanes sort of suffer for doing that. And I think this deck is a pretty good example of how that can occur, where like the vulnerability to Enchantress with this list is just, it's off the charts. It's unbelievably high. And B, the sort of general inability to have flexible power distribution allows your opponent to either flip lanes with Enchantress or their own things that go over the top of that and invalidate the investment that you're sort of obligated to make into making Captain Carter good. Because she's a card that's dependent on other cards for her value, she ends up being kind of an awkward card in terms of payoff for investment and in terms of flexibility, which are important things in Marvel Snap. One brew I've been thinking of is maybe slapping Captain Carter in this, but I find it hard to believe that that would be better than, you know, Shang-Chi or the Captain Marvel that was already in this. This is effectively a Husky Puppies brew from last week that was attempting to be a Juggernaut deck that beat other Juggernaut decks. Captain Carter is actually like, there's some stuff here, right? Like, the Zavu high rolls are really, really good. If you're able to do Galacta into Captain Carter, that's a massive amount of points in a deck that is a little bit point light, and it is a relevant thing to be doing. Like, when your hand buffs get onto Captain Carter, she's playing for a ton. You can do cool stuff here, but again, it just feels like she's a card that I would really love to play if she cost 3 and had like 2 power, but they obviously can't do that because Silver Surfer exists. And so it would just be like, this card wants to be a little bit cheaper, but it can't be because making it a little bit cheaper makes it drastically better. It wants to be a little bit stronger, but it can't be because if you make it a little bit stronger, it gets a lot stronger. And I think that this is just a very fascinating card generally to choose to make the season pass. And that's, I know we do these videos to talk about decks, but I really wanted to talk about this. For the last few months, there's been this widespread perception that season passes are like generically good and broken and amazing and awesome. I still see people, in my opinion, overrating Agamotto because they think he's like a Sam Wilson Iron Patriot level card, and he just isn't. These are the standards by which Captain Carter is being judged. And so it's more meaningful when a card like this comes out and doesn't immediately break the game. People tend to look at it and say, oh, that means she sucks. And I think that's just sort of a conversation that I wanted to have, because season passes were not always like this. We got cards like Phoenix Force and Nimrod on the season pass. We got cards like Gilgamesh, which sort of locked into one archetype and was so bad he had to get buffed on the season pass. This is a card that is a really fascinating choice for the season pass because I think it represents a sort of realization that, like, hey, you know, they don't have to be like that. And I think that Sam Wilson and Iron Patriot, to me, read as attempts to make generically good 2s, which is a space that is hard to actually do, right? Like, it's hard to make cards that are exactly Kate Bishop good and not better than Kate Bishop without being Kate Bishop. Especially because when you look at Kate Bishop, like, a lot of people still think that card's a little too good. Like, Acid Arrow really sucks. Like, it's kind of a thing, right? And so, yes, Sam and Iron Patriot, they were like hearkening back to a type of card that didn't really exist in Marvel Snap because it had previously demonstrated itself to be design issue. That is the space of 2-cost cards that can be game winning, right? Like Old Angela. I think a lot less people would have problems with Sam and Iron Patriot if Old Angela existed. In fact, I think Old Angela versus Iron Patriot is kind of a really interesting metagame to set up because one of them punishes you for not having a lot of power early while the other one is saying that I don't have a lot of power early, but I have a lot of power late. The sort of dynamic between the kind of scaling they could do is really interesting to me. I think personally that Old Angela is and would be stronger than both Sam and Iron Patriot. And so when you look at Sam and Iron Patriot, I can see design goals being, we want to make a card that is somewhere between Kate Bishop and Old Angela, and they did that, and that's what happened. But I think that's given people a sort of misapprehension as to what Season Pass cards are supposed to be. Season Pass cards are not supposed to be the best card in the game every month. They're just not. And I think people are looking at these cards and they're judging Captain Carter by the standards of that. And of course she's going to fail, because if they make the season pass card the best card in the game every month, how the hell are they going to keep making cards ever? And I think that on the whole, while I can understand people being disappointed by this card as a season pass card, I think that's probably a mistake, because I think this is a card that demonstrates a commitment to the game's long-term health, in the sense of, we're not going to power creep this card. Because I think that if they wanted to make this card strong, they could have just slapped 4/4 on it. If this card's a 4/4, it's a baseline 4/12, it's very generically strong, and it goes in a lot of stuff that Galacta and Gwenpool already go into. It would just go into the Season Pass decks, it would be a Season Passler card, it would just be that. And I think that it is like very clear, especially on a card like this, that the numbers on the card really matter. And they could have very easily chosen to do that, and they didn't. And I think that a lot of people who complain about, like, best in slot, all of that stuff, it is probably worth considering that when we talk about what these cards are. Because I think if people decide that the only reason to buy the Season Pass is if it's the best card in the game, I think we've probably lost the plot. Captain Carter's pretty good. I don't think she's overwhelmingly meta relevant, but I do think she occupies a really unique space as a sort of 4-drop amplifier for your buffs. And I think that that could make her a card that is worth having generally. And I think that that's what Season Passes probably should be more often. The Season Pass is already the best value purchase in Marvel Snap by a large margin. The fact that it has come in recent months with a card that is metagame definingly good makes it way more of a value play than it probably should be, frankly. And I think that this is a card that is exactly what the Season Pass should be. I'm going to go out on it. I'll say it. I don't think they should be making Sams and Iron Patriots on the Season Pass. I think they should be making more cards like this. And so long term, I realize Captain Carter can look like a disappointment, but I think it's forced me to reckon with, like, some of what the Season Pass has been and what the Season Pass should be. And my conclusion is that I'm probably pretty happy with her. When I look at this card, I see an interesting card that has interesting hooks and is explicitly not the power crept version of this card that they could have done. Because I think if they wanted to make this card a 4/4, it might be competitive with something like Galacta. That's the serious conversation that we have to think about. Is that good? I really want other people's input on this. I want to know what you think about what, like, let's just assume for the sake of argument, 4/3, pretty good. Maybe a 50% win rate, maybe a little below. 4/4, 53, 54% win rate. Worse than Sam Wilson, worse than Galacta, but in that range, probably goes in a lot of decks with them, right? Let's assume that's true. Which of these would you prefer Captain Carter have released as? Which of those profiles? That's what I want to know. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one, as long as you remember to like, subscribe, and make sure you leave a comment about that last question I just asked. I will see you later, guys. Have a good one, guys, gals, non-binary pals, everybody. Later.